It's really wonderful to be here and in this university, in this town. And I want to talk about our book today. And this is a book that several of us have worked on together. It is myself and David Wang, Chris Hess, Chuanfei Wang, and Lenka, and also Monica de Cavallo. And this is a project that really started at Sophia University in Tokyo, and also really, though, has been a global project. So it's called the Global Japanese Restaurant. And it is, I think, a very unusual project because it takes Japanese studies really outside of Japan and actually all around the world. So it's that's what we're going to be talking about today. The book is actually, you can buy the electronic version or the hardcover version, which is overly overcharged. For some reason, they sold out of the paperback version. I don't think that means it's a bestseller. I just think they printed too few copies. But please do see if you can buy it. So first of all, I want to talk about the rise of the Japanese restaurant. Now, if you look at these numbers, which some of you might have seen before, the numbers of Japanese restaurants have really risen from 2004 to 2019, steadily straight up, and during the COVID pandemic, actually continued to rise. And there were some markets in the world that surprisingly, even with all the shutdowns, we still see an increase in Japanese restaurants. For example, in Thailand, the number of Japanese restaurants has continued to rise. And mentioning Thailand is important because actually the story of Japanese restaurants is really a story of Asia. And it is, of course, also there's a great number of Japanese restaurants in Europe, and we've been talking about that, and in North America, but the real explosion has been in Asia, especially in China, in fact. So this project is a global project. We tried to, it was sort of absurdly ambitious. We tried to cover every continent. We actually did field work ourselves in most of these places, and other than us six, there were over 10, I guess 15 or so research assistants who helped us, many of whom were Sophia students. It's a very multicultural, bilingual, trilingual, multilingual place. So we worked in Asia, Europe, North America, South America. We also did a lot of historical work trying to find out the origins of the Japanese restaurant as an institution in various places around the world. And it really tries to decenter Japan. So even though we are, in a sense, in Japan studies, actually all of us have degrees in global studies. And so we are really looking at Japanese restaurant as a global phenomenon, not just something exported by Japan, but something created outside of Japan. And another feature of this story is that there's been a lot written about the Japanese restaurant outside of Japan, but mostly centered in California, mostly looking at the US. So we really try to take this story outside of the US, although we do look a lot at New York City in particular. We look at the Japanese restaurant as a global imaginary, as something that is sort of imagined on a global scale, and also as a fashion that has traveled the world. And we think about restaurants as a space that you consume food, but you also consume ideas, images, and performances. So the restaurant is a space of performance. We think of the restaurant as theater. It's embodied in the idea of fashion, and that is that restaurants become fashionable, they become places that people want to go, and then they lose their popularity. So there's a sort of arc of fashion. This is promulgated often by different types of cultural intermediaries. And part of the book here is not just documenting the restaurant, but documenting the types of people who are going to be promoting the restaurant. So we start with print media, and we move then to actually sort of people working in video media, television, film, and then more recently, digital media. And these different types of cultural intermediaries have an impact on these fashions. And these fashions are cyclical. So one of the things that we try to do is get away from the idea that there's been a steady increase in the popularity of the Japanese restaurant, but we look at different food fashions that have emerged over a very long period of time, starting in the late 19th century and all the way until the contemporary period. One of the pieces that we focus on is the centrality of networks of global cities. And these are really places like Tokyo, New York, Shanghai, London, Paris. And we, in a sense, try to map out what we would say are the culinary global cities. When we look at these culinary global cities, two cities are, of course, central to our story is New York and Tokyo. Everybody talks about Tokyo all the time. especially in New York. But when you're outside of New York, people talk a lot about New York in the restaurant world. And if you're talking about restaurant owners and chefs. And so Tokyo is often reflected through a lens of New York. And then for Europe, reflected through London. So from New York to London, and from London all over to like Milan or maybe Berlin, or so there's certain sort of cities that have an outsized impact on how people understand food. And the way this works, I think, is both through networks of influence and also the agglomeration effects of people being in cities working together. So chefs talk about learning from other chefs in these cities. So even if you're in Sao Paulo and you're talking to a Japanese restaurant owner, they're going to talk about being in New York City and learning about the restaurant business in New York City, not necessarily in Tokyo, but Tokyo would be another hub. But New York emerges as the most important place in this global network. These are the fashions that we talk about in the book, and we're going to talk about today. The tea room, the earliest one, then sukiyaki, then teppanyaki, the sushi bar, the ramen bar, and the izakaya. And today we're going to be mostly focusing on the tea room. We're going to actually talk about, I think, all of them, but teppanyaki. I don't know why we skipped teppanyaki. So Lenka will talk about the tea room.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so as already mentioned, the story of Japanese restaurants, which came to become really booming throughout the 20th century, really started at the end of the 19th century. And we find it very important for our story because despite the fact that Japanese food was not really the central element in the eatery during those times, still there were some basic characteristics that were then replied in following fashion cycles. And now here I talk about aesthetics of interior design, where the purity of design was crucial, and also the role of kimono-clad servers. So like these geisha-based kind of performative creators, which were then moving throughout the fashion circle. So we can see during the times of tea room, and we will see then through sukiyaki and later on. What is important for the first restaurant boom was the role of world expositions, because it was clearly through world expositions that the Japanese culture came to be known to the world. For our story, the Paris International Exposition was a key one, because it was the first one where Japanese empire had official presence. So the delegation was headed by the younger brother of Shogun, Tokugawa Akitake. And it seems that timely, they really, the local people in France, especially the local press, were really interested in the presence of Japanese. Among others, there were some articles that we found where it was mentioned that it was observed that Japanese eat raw fish cut into small pieces, poured into special sauce. So it seems that it was the first time that sushi was reflected in Europe. So that was the central part of the Japanese part of the exposition was this tea room. And besides tea room, actually the appreciation for Japanese culture and design especially came to be the thing that helped to the Japanese culture and Japanese culinary culture as it is to spread well as well. So it was this appreciation for the Japanese design known as Japanism that really kicked out after the Paris exposition. A central piece was also this ceramic service Rousseau by Braquemont, because it was inspired by engravings of Hokusai or graphic studies by Hiroshige. And actually, Braquemont himself was an interesting character, because he created an art society called Jinglar, and with fellow artists, they were reportedly meeting every month for dinners in a Japanese style, where all the participants had to wear kimono, and they ate rice using chopsticks. So it was still not officialized as restaurants, but the interest in Japanese culinary culture was there. In the following expositions, the Japanese tea houses became more and more elaborated. So, for example, this one at the big and important Chicago Columbian exposition was part of a larger Phoenix Palace, which was actually a replica of the Byodo-in Palace in Kyoto. And the popularity of tea rooms during the expositions then helped the development of this really boom as something which went beyond like these artificial spaces. And one of the first really business type Japanese tea rooms was the tea room in a Chicago Congress Hotel, which was founded in 1908. And you can see we have got this picture of the menu, where apart from different types of both Western type but also Japanese tea, you can see what kind of small food could be served. So there's, for example, Japanese crystallized pineapple or ginger. So it seems that there was interest in what kind of food can be served together with the Japanese tea. It's true that, like as James mentioned, that the fashion usually started in bigger cities. Maybe with a bigger presence of Japanese traders or settlers. But then with the time, it went beyond those big global cities. And what we found that actually in Prague in 1908, which was quite cosmopolitan during that time, there was actually a Japanese tea room also built for the big trade exposition. And that was thanks to the traveler and art collector Joe Blocha, who went repeatedly to Japan, and who then created this tea room for the exposition. And it seems that during the exposition, the success was so huge that after the end of it, they actually moved the interiors into the newly built Palác Lucerna that you might know. And so the Palác Lucerna in Prague, which was a brand new center for entertainment in Prague, had this beautiful Japanese tea room, where reportedly there were even two Japanese and, well, one Japanese and one Chinese girl serving guests as geisha. And well, if you have a look at the advertisement, this is the local advertisement from the press. So you can see that really the active promotion of such venues in media was really serving as the most important intermediary for the spread of the culture. Well, the role of Joe Blocha in actively promoting Japanese culture didn't stop there, because in 1924 he bought a small villa in Rostoki, close to Prague, and he had it rebuilt in a Japanese style with an ornamental roof and decorations, and also with a Japanese garden, and he called it Villa Sakura. Unfortunately, 2 years later, he had to sell the house because he needed money funding for his next trip to Japan. But the owners who bought the new owners who bought the villa, they actually decided to build a bigger villa in the same style next door, and made a hotel called Big Sakura next to it. And this hotel was active for 10 years until the beginning of the World War II. And you can see that the interiors were very beautifully made with ink paintings and sliding doors with the lanterns. And we found archival data where it's said that the main chef, Tonio Horsky, who was the chef for the restaurant of the hotel, was creating exotizing dishes. So it was not still a pure Japanese food, but it was kind of like exotized offer of food in this hotel. And now we will move to sukiyaki, which was the fashion, which came with some parts of the basic characteristics that was also seen during the tea room times.
Right. So I think that what's important about sukiyaki, in some ways, sukiyaki is the first Japanese restaurant fashion in which food was the main item. But I want to emphasize that I guess our entire book is premised on the idea that when people go to Japanese restaurants, food is not the main thing that they're really consuming. They're consuming the idea of Japan, the social space, the performance, the entertainment. And in many ways, then the tea room is really emblematic of that, because the Japanese food was almost never the main thing in a tea room, but tea rooms were extremely popular, not just in a few examples, like what you see, the really fabulous example in Prague, but even in small cities in the United States, for example, would have Japanese tea rooms through the 1920s. By the 1920s, this is disappearing. The tea room thing is fading, and a very new thing is coming around. And this has led, really the advent of sukiyaki as a global restaurant form. And it's usually called the sukiyaki house. And I think sukiyaki, if you don't know it, is made with beef. It's sliced beef. You have then soy sauce is the most important ingredient, and then mirin and sugar, and then various vegetables. It's a very flexible dish. In some ways, it's a Western dish that has been Japanized originally. And so it's repackaged then as Japanese food, but it's something very familiar to Westerners, partly because soy sauce was becoming familiar to Western people in New York or in places that had Chinese restaurants. So before you had sukiyaki boom, you had the chop suey boom in the United States. So people that were familiar with Chinese food were able to eat soy sauce. And so that was the one key ingredient that made this exotic and strange, but also palatable for Westerners, and then that and meat. Again, like the one thing that the sukiyaki restaurant had very much in common with the tea room is the importance of women who were dressed in a Japanese style and did personal service. And this was very important. So you can see this image here of the Japanese woman who is serving then, this is an American sukiyaki restaurant that was in the later phases of the boom, in the post-war phase, 1950s and 60s, when the sukiyaki restaurants were quite big. And this is a kind of image, we found many, many images like this, often in the form of postcards, by the way. Before you had Instagram, you would often restaurants sold postcards. And so when you can find one of the images, the kinds of data we could find are lots of old postcards from Japanese restaurants, especially in the United States. But sukiyaki boom started before the Second World War. It started in the 1920s. And it was run by Japanese people. So many of the tea rooms you saw were not run by Japanese people, but by other types of folks. Japanese restaurant owners started sukiyaki often on the basis of first doing chop suey. If you see the image here, it says chop suey, and at the bottom you say it's sukiyaki, because many of the earliest Japanese restaurant owners ran Chinese restaurants. Just like today, you have Chinese restaurant owners running Japanese restaurants. In the 1910s and 20s, many Japanese would run Chinese restaurants in the United States. And they switched to being sukiyaki restaurants in the 20s and 30s as sukiyaki becomes a global food fashion. And the West Coast was the beginning. All of these are California, West Coast restaurants. This is the most famous maybe of that period, the Yamato. It's a huge restaurant in San Francisco. And again, you see the image of the Japanese woman serving then the Western white guest. And that would be the typical marketing image of these places. Again, this is Busch Gardens. It was an enormous restaurant in Seattle. That it was really huge. It could serve hundreds of people in one day. And you can see the sukiyaki service, which is always performed at the table. So sukiyaki was a very labor-intensive type of restaurant. You had to spend a lot of money hiring women who worked in the restaurants. This one reason you could do this is because of labor market discrimination in the United States. It's very difficult for Asian Americans to find work. And so these restaurants were a kind of ghettoized form of labor. And they basically absorbed a lot of the Japanese American labor force all the way through the period of the 1960s, in which case it became, because of anti-discrimination legislation, it became much easier for Asian Americans to get the primary labor market And all these people started working in other jobs. But until the 1960s, Japanese American women were the main employees of these restaurants, including many women after the Second World War who'd married American soldiers, moved back to the United States, and had to find work because they found out their husbands, who were these American soldiers, were not very well off. Maybe they weren't as rich as they thought they might be. This also was in Europe. This is a pretty rare photograph from Berlin. So there were smaller numbers of Japanese restaurants, again, run by the Japanese community around what's now if you know Berlin, there's like the Kantstrasse that has Japanese restaurants today around there. And there were also Japanese restaurants during the 1920s, 30s, all the way back to the 1890s. This restaurant is called Akebono. It was run by a Japanese man who had married a German woman. This was a typical pattern in Europe, that a Japanese man would marry a European woman and run a small restaurant. This is a fairly large one. It survived until 1943. November 1943, the bombing of Berlin destroyed most of the central city, and that was the end of this restaurant. But you also had the rebirth of the Japanese sukiyaki restaurant in Germany after the war. And so this is a famous one in Hamburg called the Kogetsu, which was run by a Japanese family who actually went back to Japan later and ran a very famous Japanese restaurant in Japan, and actually got a Michelin star, amazingly. So they were the writer who wrote about this talked about this really almost entirely in terms of the female the sort of geisha style of service, and this is something I think we emphasize in our presentation, because when you read the reports of Japanese restaurants in the 1920s and 30s, whether you're reading a German one or an American one or a Chinese one, they all talk about the female servers as the main feature of the restaurant. It's a sort of phenomenon that really was a global phenomenon. You see, Shanghai was really the center of this boom in Asia. Shanghai was the largest financial center in East Asia from the period of the 1870s all the way through 1940s. The city of Shanghai had more expatriate foreign residents than all of Japan combined, for example. So if you were a Westerner going to Asia, you were probably more likely to eat sukiyaki in Shanghai than you were in Japan. And Shanghai became a center of Japanese restaurants. You can see here one of the photos we found from the Shanghai archives, Shanghai Municipal Archives, is that there were actually sukiyaki parties. And we found so many articles about sukiyaki parties in the Shanghai Municipal Archive. And they would always be like, oh, this tennis club had a sukiyaki party. But to me, as an American, the most interesting one was that the American military, when they went to Shanghai, almost always had sukiyaki parties. So even until the 1930s, when the American Navy was facing off Japan, the American Navy would go to Shanghai and have a sukiyaki party. And this particular one was held every week. So literally thousands of American soldiers who went through Shanghai, whether it was Army or Navy, and this photo here actually has Army and Navy and their spouses and family would go eat sukiyaki in the YMCA. So sukiyaki restaurants and sukiyaki parties were really a major feature of the culture at the time. And I think that a lot of this happened in a few cities, but Shanghai probably being one of the most important. So I think Shanghai was probably as important for spreading sukiyaki around the world as any other city would have been. We have a lot of stories about that. There were many restaurants in Shanghai also serving sukiyaki, like the one I just showed. This is the most famous, by the way, called Rokusante, which was founded in 1905. 60 geishas worked at Rokusante, and it was a major urban landmark in Shanghai. People like Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen all dined at the Rokusante in Shanghai. So I think then we move on to sushi. I guess I'll do sushi as well. All right. So the one food fashion that everyone knows is sushi. And I think many people, and we probably felt this too, before we started writing this book, we thought sushi was the first global Japanese restaurant boom, that this was the first time that Japanese food had been popular around the world. And when we started doing the research, we realized that sukiyaki and the tea room had preceded it and were in fact very popular. But sushi, of course, is the biggest boom of all, right? And it really it is on a different scale. It starts really in some ways in the 1960s in the West Coast of the US. It really, though, becomes a boom, I would say, only after it leaves California and goes to places like New York, where it really becomes a global phenomenon. So only being in San Francisco and Los Angeles, it was not really a global food fashion. What we emphasize in the book is that what was popular about sushi was not simply the food, but the way it is served along a sushi bar. The social space of the restaurant was radically new. For an expensive restaurant, for you to sit there at a bar and eat your food at the bar served to you by the person making the food was really a huge innovation. So the chef who used to be in the kitchen and you never saw is now personally serving you, making the food in front of you. Not only did this change Japanese fine dining, it has permanently changed fine dining all over the world. So if you go to a really fancy restaurant in most cities, you will also experience this, even if it's not Japanese food. It's also the notion of omakase, the notion that you eat what the chef wants you to eat. This is something that completely violated the rules of the French restaurant, where the whole idea of the French restaurant is you have a menu and you order what you want. In the omakase restaurant, you don't even know what you're going to get. It was important, I think, though, that the sushi restaurant became globally popular, not because just of Japanese running them, but later on because of all the other people who were not Japanese people running sushi restaurants. And often what they're selling is not something that would be familiar in Japan. So this is all made popular in films, especially out of the US. And if you look at, and in the 1980s, if you're old enough, you'd remember some of these films that were the first places that a lot of Americans thought sushi is cool, like The Breakfast Club, Burn After Reading, Friends. These are all 1980s sitcoms. So if you know these, that means you're old. So what is sushi? I think you all know, but it's really interesting. This is, in most of the world, this is sushi. It's the California roll. It looks like that. If you go to Nairobi and eat sushi, if you go to Sri Lanka and have sushi, if you go to the Philippines, you're going to find, you're most likely to get something that looks like this, which is invented largely in the West Coast of the United States in the 1960s. It's made usually with California rice, not with Japanese rice. If you're in Europe, you might have Italian rice or Spanish rice. Most of the world, it's going to be California rice. Even in, and maybe not in China, you get dongbei, kind of Manchurian rice. It's going to be made with Norwegian salmon. It's farmed salmon. It's an industrial product. It's either from Norway or Chile. It's these huge multinationals doing aquaculture. You're getting industrial cream cheese. This is a product that was largely introduced into sushi in the United States. And you're getting Mexican avocados, which is a product that, well, an aspect of sushi introduced in California, probably by Japanese American farmers. So many, when I were looking into the history of the California roll, one thing we realized that Japanese Americans were growing avocados a lot. So I think it was probably the Japanese American farmers who were very familiar with avocados from growing them who introduced avocados into sushi. But it becomes a global phenomenon. You get avocados in sushi everywhere, except for in tropical countries like Philippines or Brazil, you're more likely to get mango, because mango serves the same purpose. So you get a lot of mango as a kind of global thing in the global south. And it's usually made by migrant labor. So sushi really is global food. It is come together as a kind of globalized fast food. And even though we associate it with Japan, it is really something that has been produced in all these different regions. And avocados, for example, are a Mexican thing, but you would also have a lot of Israeli avocados in Europe, for example. It is also food fashion. I love this photo. When I was in Berlin doing research for this project, this is in Friedrichshain, a very trendy part of Berlin. And there's this huge sign up there, sushi is für immer. And it's like, you know, sushi is for always. And you've got this picture of this man giving his girlfriend a box. And instead of it being a diamond, like diamonds forever, it's a little piece of sushi. So she gets that. And it's the association of sushi with romance, with glamour. And sushi is often seen as a woman's food outside of Japan. So if you're in Italy and people would often say, oh, you know, Italians don't really like Asian food, but women like Asian, you know, sushi. So if you're on a date, you go to eat sushi. So it is seen also in California as a dating food. If you invite someone for sushi, that means you're asking them out on a date. So I think that the image of sushi as a feminized form of consumption, as something romantic and personal and intimate, is also associated with the way that it's eaten along a bar. This is especially true in a place like China, where eating in a restaurant usually means eating at a big table with lots of men noisily drinking baijiu, like drinking hard alcohol. And in fact, sushi is where you go and you can avoid that sort of male-dominated, noisy space. This is just another example of sushi made outside of Japan. The temakaria, which is something that was invented in Brazil. It's a temaki sushi, the roll sushi that you see. It's rolled with nori, and you do get temaki in Japan. But the temakaria, as a kind of fast food joint, is invented in Brazil, and many of the ingredients are very much Americanized. They are not from Japan, but actually they are things that especially salmon, which is something that comes from originally from US sushi, and cream cheese. So these two really important ingredients that the Japanese did not eat in sushi are really US influences on Brazil, but the Brazilians have repackaged it as the temakaria, but also in using ingredients like jalapeno peppers, which is really a Mexican thing. So the Mexican thing comes to Brazil via the United States as well. So there's this sort of circulation of ideas that then go. And then, of course, you have temakarias now in places like Italy. So we interviewed owners of temakaria chain in Rome, who also who have picked this up from Brazil. So this circulation of food fashions now happens independent of Japan. So what is counting as Japanese food now is made everywhere. I think sushi is probably the most famous example, but ramen is pushing it as the second most famous.
Yeah, if sushi was the example where sushi and like Japanese food became really globally famous, it was still not accessible to everyone, right? Especially in people's minds. Whereas ramen is the first fashion where really Japanese food has become accessible to really anyone, because the notion of Japanese food through ramen changed from something really high-end to something that might be fast food. It might be also connected to branding. So like what we saw until now, the whole notion of images and the imaginary related to Japanese cuisine during the time when we can find ramen restaurants, it's something that the chefs and the owners of businesses can monetize on. So it's the branding which comes in, because ramen is still Japanese food, but it's Japanese food that can be accessed by anyone, right? And if with sushi we were talking about, or even with previous Japanese restaurant fashions, we were mostly stressing out the feminized space and the role of geisha and the female servers. Here, the space become much more masculine, much more vibrant, let's say, much more like vivid. And so that there is also a change in the cultural mediation, because it's not anymore the printed media, it's not the official owners and official organizers of fairs. It's now the, more or less influencers who can be known through digital media, or even self-promoting celebrity chefs who started to create the image and the branding of the restaurant. So very famous examples are David Chang or Ivan Orkin, who are really known as the figures who made ramen really famous through their not only restaurants, but for example, I think both of them, they had these documentaries in Netflix, etc. So they really made the story of ramen and what it means to make ramen, to serve ramen, and to consume ramen. They made this story available to the whole world. With ramen, also we can see the increasing corporatization of the food of the restaurant. So it's the story of different chains that we can follow throughout the world. And we will give you example of one of these chains. And if we talk about the corporatization, we talk also about democratization of the food through having the food available, accessible, fast, rapidly, and for a cheap price. So it's the McDonaldization. And I want to tell you the story of Menya Musashi, which is a company that we covered a lot in the book. And James interviewed the owners of Menya Musashi in Japan, in Tokyo, and I interviewed then people who run the stores in Kiev, in Ukraine. And I think you also had some stories maybe from China, right?
Yeah.
Later on. So like Menya Musashi was founded in 1996 by two apparel industry veterans. So they were not initially chefs or people in the fine dining. They wanted to create a company, a business for them, where they would elevate ramen from something, like greasy food, something which could be, well, like performative, but also experience, like dining experience that you can enjoy as it is. What is interesting is that like Menya Musashi at the beginning was growing just slowly at the Japanese market, but once it left the Japanese islands, it really grew incredibly rapidly. So by 2021, they had more than 1,000 franchised outlets internationally. In Hong Kong, Singapore, China, but also Hawaii or Ukraine. And as I said, if we have a look at the name, so Menya Musashi, even the logo is created based on the image of the famous warrior, the samurai who was fighting with two swords. So it's really a space, a place where these cooks are fighting with the fire, and they are creating the dishes. And of course, even in Menya Musashi as other ramen shops, they incorporate the performative shoutings of the staff. So when customers come, everyone, all the members of the staff, they shout "Irashaimase." So it's, you feel like you are part of the environment, and you are not really there to be silently consuming your healthy food. You are there to enjoy yourself. And well, of course, that ramen is a dish which is less demanding on the skills of labor than sushi. Sushi is, and also that contributed to the spread of the outlets throughout the world, and especially in case of this particular brand, because through the franchising business, the owners, they don't really check on the level of food in the outlets overseas. They check on the branding, that they want to see that the branding of the restaurants is there, but they don't really go into details. And well, what is interesting is also that the corporate center is not in Japan. The corporate center for overseas business is in Singapore. So, it's very much really global chain of suppliers, but the whole story is connected through the imaginary of ramen as being such type of food. And we can show you how these outlets, which are whether in China or Ukraine, they seem quite similar, but a part of having some very basic standards on feeling in the space as in very modern environment and dynamic one. It's not actually very strict on the owners. So based on their budget, they can really create the restaurants how they want. And the same goes for the training of the staff. So actually the franchisees, they really get connected through internet with the corporate center. Then they get all the paperwork done. They pay to be able to use the brand name, but then it's on their own whether they want to go and send some of their chefs to Japan or to other outlets, for example, in Asia. But it's completely their decision. The ownership, it's not one of the ownerships, actually, Mr. Sivochuk, whom we met. So he was one of the entrepreneurs who created the branch in Ukraine, And actually, after the Russian invasion of the part of Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, they had to flee their home city, and they were looking for new food, new restaurant type to create in Kiev. And they found out that there were no ramen restaurants in the city, and that's how they decided to go on with Menya, well, after finding the information online. In their case, Artem Sivochuk, who is here portrayed on the picture, he went for a few times to Japan for several weeks, and he was training. Just directly, really on-the-job training, like Japanese do. He shot a lot of videos of the actual atmosphere of the ramen bar, how it's noisy in Japan, in Tokyo, and then back when they created the venues in Kiev, there were like in every restaurant there were 2 or 3 big screens where they were showing what they actually shot in Japan. So it was kind of vibrant space where they were trying to show, well, this is authentic ramen shop, and we do it in the same way as it's done in Japan. So I must say they survived COVID, they survived the following invasion which is going on. So even now the Musashi Menya in Kiev, they have got still 4 or 5 venues, and they're going on. And yeah, it's quite different than with some other ramen brands, as we know, for example, Ippudo, who are much more focused on very small details about how the dishes are made. So with ramen, I must say it's really kind of like the branding is part of the decision of what kind of image you want to really show to your customers, whether it's the whole space and experience, or whether it's focused on the dish itself. And we are going to izakaya, which is even, I would say, more fluid, as Jim is going to tell you.
Right. So this is the last type of restaurant we're going to talk about. One of the things reason we're ending with the izakaya, I think the izakaya brings home the point that we start with the Japanese tea house. And that is, the Japanese restaurant is really about the space and not necessarily about a particular type of food. So I know that when people think about Japanese food being popular, they often think about what's on the plate. Oh, it's healthy or what have you. But actually, when you look at what we've seen, I think it's been more about the type of social environment created. And the izakaya is a perfect example of that. It really, like the tea house, there's no particular food that you have to have in an izakaya. You can sell anything in an izakaya, in fact. But what's one of the key ingredients is that it's a new way of marketing Japanese food. So if you're in a big city like New York or London, you're thinking, how can I make more money? Because restaurants are it's a very difficult business. And the one way is to sell more alcohol. And one thing, Japanese restaurants had never been associated with alcohol, because all throughout this 100-year history, Japanese had never been able to market sake successfully as a popular drink, or shochu, or any Japanese drink. But with the izakaya, this has changed, and sake has become very popular, and Japanese restaurants have been able to market Japanese sake and beer, and of course whiskey, as high-end beverages, and increase their profit margins in very expensive markets like New York, London, Shanghai, Hong Kong. So I think it has to do a lot with the needs of restaurateurs to make money and to increase their margins. But also with customers wanting to have more fun, trying to get a new type of customer. The restaurant has night space. And also the other aspect of it that started with ramen, that is, Japanese restaurants are more and more corporations. It's not just individuals, but you would need to have a corporate structure. You want to be able to replicate this easily. You want to make labor cheap. So izakaya labor is cheaper. You can get a university student, dress them up, and send them to work, and they don't need to know how to do much. They don't need to really, they don't have to make sukiyaki at the table. They don't have to make sushi in front of you. They don't even have to make ramen. They just have to serve the food. The spectacle is now created by the consumer. The consumer participates in loud drinking games, especially in the United States. You have the sake bomb game, where you have a sake on top of beer and you bang the table, sake bomb, sake bomb, sake bomb. And then the sake falls into the beer and then you drink it like that. And so it's a kind of a drinking game that's associated with the izakaya. So this is one of the most exaggerated izakayas in New York City called Kenka. It's if you see the menu of Kenka, you can see it has all kinds of insane dishes, and including bull penis and all sorts of things. You have the emperor, which is really Hirohito there, which is no Japanese restaurant would put the emperor on an izakaya menu. And you have a young woman being tied up, and you have a sort of image of Japanese fetish porn. And the whole restaurant is done in this image to create an exaggerated image of what Japan is. And the owner is Japanese, but he's sort of a punk rock Japanese. He also has sort of a punk rock secondhand clothing store. So the idea is that Japan can be marketed as a edgy nightlife space. And Kenka was opened in 2005 or 2006. And it was very, very important in changing the image of the izakaya, making the izakaya something very cool in New York. And that sort of spread around. Now, China is an interesting case of the izakaya. In some ways, whereas in China, what they're creating is also an image of drinking culture. But it's a very different image of drinking culture, aimed not at the Chinese men who drink hard liquor with their friends, but rather at trying to get young people, especially women, to drink. And so izakaya culture in China introduces a softer drinking culture. And it has an image associated a lot with Japanese media. So in the US, in New York, or maybe in other places, if you're on Netflix, of course, Netflix is global, you can see this everywhere, you might know Shinya Shokudo, this Japanese TV show. And in China, this is very popular. There's even a Chinese version of Shinya Shokudo. In English called Midnight Diner. And in Chinese, it's Shenye Shitang, and there's actually a Chinese version of that's run in Chinese. And it's the image for Chinese consumers of the izakaya is a place where you communicate with other people, where you talk to your friends, where there's a sense of community. And this has proven very popular with Chinese young women. So interestingly, even though in the United States, izakaya has been a loud drinking culture associated with things like the sake bomb, in China, it's a sort of a soft, feminized drinking culture associated with very small izakaya. So this is like Tianjin. This is one of our co-authors, Chuan Fei Wang, is from Tianjin. So she did some extensive field work amongst the izakayas, which is interestingly in the old Japanese concession. Tianjin was the only Chinese city that actually had a Japanese concession, which was run by the Japanese consulate. And so there's a whole sort of a rundown part of Tianjin. So you actually have some cheap izakaya spaces, and there's several of the images. They're outside, they're very small little businesses. And you can see the inside. This is Arfanju, and that's just some Chinese young people run this. You can see most of the customers are women. They hang out at the bar with their female friends. The staff is male. And that's very common, have men serving women, and the women are mostly there to chat with each other. They drink slowly, they drink over a long period of time. And it is not then a place where you go to do the Chinese style of drinking. So if you've been in northern China in particular, there's a lot of drinking with hard liquor, and it's a male dominated activity. And a lot of women feel like it's not as comfortable as this type of space. So China and the izakaya culture has been adapted in different places in different ways. But I would say one thing it's been very successful is marketing alcohol, and also a notion that there's a Japanese style of sociability. And so, in other words, it's a sort of social space where you go to talk with people in a kind of, in East Asia in particular, in a kind of intimate way. The izakaya is seen as an intimate space, which I think comes from more direct contact with Japanese izakaya and also Japanese media. Whereas I think in the US, it is seen as a more loud party space. So when we come to the very end of this, I think what holds all of these food fashions together is the emphasis on the restaurant as a social space. So I'll just sort of summarize what we are talking about in the book, and there's a lot of things that are in here that we haven't talked about. So one is that I think that the expansion of the Japanese cuisine, which is a real thing. I think Japanese cuisine is now popular all over the world, and in places from sub-Saharan Africa all the way to Asia or Latin America. But it's been really about the forms of the restaurant. And one of the things is that there are many different forms of the restaurant. If we think of what's special about Japanese food, I would say one particular thing that's quite special about it was that Edo was 200 years ago, the largest city in the world, and has developed a diversity of restaurant forms, actually. So that when Japan starts exporting its cuisine, it's exporting things like the izakaya, like the ramen, or these are things that are invented in Japan, of course, but they're invented in the largest city in the world. And so there's many different varieties of restaurant spaces that Japan did have. I think that is an important aspect of the story. And this includes then performance, the idea of the restaurant as a theater. It's a place you go to experience the city, experience urban life. And I think for people going to a sukiyaki place, it was always about the women. Later on, the teppanyaki was about Japanese men doing like this, cutting up things, flipping them in the air. The sushi is about, the performance of the sushi chef as an expert, who always has to look like the master. And nowadays, actually, the izakaya is about you as the customer becoming part of the performance. I think the other thing is that this is about one of the things that's interesting about it for us is that many of these things rose and fell. In other words, no one even knows about the Japanese tea house anymore. It's completely forgotten. No one remembers this. The sukiyaki house, people remember it, but they only in places like maybe California where there's still some old ones. So things come and they go. So it's not as though Japanese food has always been popular. The things that are popular now are not the same as what was popular 100 years ago. It always, though, is centered in global cities. Paris was the most important city of the 19th century. I think it's not surprising that it had the biggest impact, the expos. But from the 1920s on, New York has been the most important city for the spread of food culture. And you can see this by talking to chefs. And they will always end up, many of them move through New York. But but there's other cities as well. London is important. Increasingly, Tokyo is important. And Tokyo is a very important food city now for high-end fine dining. And I think then the other thing is that more and more this boom in Japanese food is not led by Japanese people, but non-Japanese chefs. And also one thing that we talk about a lot in the book is the importance of women who were not the chefs, but who are running the front of the house, the women managers, the waitresses, who are actually really important in introducing Japanese food. And all over the world, the most important intermediaries doing this work are Asian people. So whether it's especially Chinese people. So a lot of the people we talk about in the book are Chinese Americans or Chinese Europeans. So if you go to Italy or France or along the Rhineland in Germany or all over the East Coast of the United States, it's always Chinese migrants who are making Japanese food. Other places, it's Korean migrants, whether it's like Hamburg or maybe parts of California, it'll be Korean migrants. And then in places like, I think in Czech Republic or in eastern part of Germany, it's Vietnamese migrants. So all over the world, you have East Asian people making Japanese food. And those people have been really important to the story of spreading Japanese food. And so we interviewed a lot of those owners in our book. So I think that's something that's not been recognized in Japanese studies, the importance of Asian migrants in making Japanese food. But if you go to places like sub-Saharan Africa, it's mostly African people making Japanese food because you don't have as many East Asian migrants there, but you will have, so in sushi chefs in the future, because this is where people are developing these skills. And so it's an ongoing development and transfer of this knowledge around the world. And finally, there is the importance of the food industry is more and more corporate. So there's a lot of large-scale food corporations selling things like ramen. And when I interviewed the guy at Musashi Menya, it was really interesting that what he was telling us was this is branding. It was pure branding. I mean, you can just buy the brand and make your ramen. He doesn't care how you make it as long as he gets his money. So there is an element here of just naked capitalism in the food business that I think we definitely emphasize in the story. So this is the book, and we do hope you will try to buy it, even though it's hard to get. But,
I think one copy is going to be available at the university library. So I think that one is going to be for you.
Yeah, so and as soon as we can, we will try to get a free copy posted somewhere on the internet, but we haven't done that yet. So thank you very much for your time.